Hi, welcome back to the Stick Figure Historian, where we make history interesting. Sorry guys, still working on the intro. Maybe I need a theme song. Anyway, last week, in episode 34, we covered the Roundhead defeat at Lostwithiel in September 1644. And that defeat was only to be followed by further disappointment in October. Sir William Waller, Edward Montague, the Earl of Manchester, and the cowardly old Robin, freshly returned from his flight, went head-to-head with Charles himself again in Newbury. The battle ended much as Edgehill had. To this day, no one is really sure who won. The Roundheads seem to have had partial advantage, for by the end of it all, King Charles was heading back to Oxford. Cromwell saw yet another chance slipping away. The king was retreating. If he moved right now, surely he and his cavalry could overtake him. And if they captured the king, wouldn't that mean the end of the war? He waited impatiently as the three generals discussed, or argued, rather, over what to do. At last the word was given. Cromwell, William Balfour, and Arthur Haselrig were to pursue King Charles and capture him if possible. But, as usual, all that earlier bickering proved to be their downfall. By the time the Roundhead cavalry moved, Charles was already quite safely across the Thames and on his merry way to Oxford, surrounded on every side by loyal royalist country. No matter, the Roundheads thought. We'll attack Donnington Castle then. The king has left most of his supplies and wounded men there. We'll get revenge that way. But even this turned into a failure. The royalists left behind defended the walls quite ably, and it was many a Roundhead that fell before the castle that day. They drew back and began to set a siege. Disappointment only sank in deeper as November began. Charles came back and rescued his castle, along with another stronghold in Basingstoke that the Roundheads had been threatening. 1644 might have begun poorly for the Royalists with the Battle of Marston Moor, but it would seem the year was to end on a happier note. Edward Montague was glum. He had been glum ever since the fighting started, but now he was glummer still. The king need not care how oft he fights, he complained. If we beat the king 99 times, yet he is king still, and so will his posterity be after him. But if the king beat us once, we shall all be hanged, and our posterity be made slaves. In other words, he knew that however many times they fought and beat the Royalists, if they didn't kill or capture the king himself, he would just keep rallying men together and fighting again. And if the king defeated them just one time, all of them would be executed, and their families would lose their money and positions. Cromwell wasn't glum. He was angry. He had been angry ever since the battle at Newbury. And just as he had known what was amiss at Edgehill, he knew what was amiss now. Everyone was focusing way too much on bickering instead of doing anything. And hearing Montague say this was especially irritating, because he himself was part of the problem. If Montague had not spent so much time arguing with the other generals, perhaps they would have captured the king at Newbury. If this be so, he shot back at him, why did we take up arms at first? This is against fighting ever hereafter. If so, let us make peace, be it never so base. Basically, Cromwell was saying, well, then why did we even start fighting in the first place? Why don't we just quit then, like cowards, and forget the whole thing? He didn't really mean this. He wasn't for quitting. He said it because he was frustrated with the Earl's lack of spirit. And actually, Cromwell wasn't just frustrated with Montague. He was mad at old Robin, too, and pretty well fed up with the House of Lords as a whole. Many opportunities and much time had been wasted by their arguing and inefficiency. And part of that inefficiency was caused by hesitation, and part of that hesitation was caused by a desire for peace. Many of the lords had not really been all on board with the war in the first place, and more it became evident that what they really wanted was peace. Cromwell, still a member of the House of Commons, couldn't agree less. He was for war. He wanted to push this thing through to the fullest end. Why give up now, when they had already lost so much to gain the power that they wanted? It would all be a waste. The halls of Westminster rang with more arguing that winter. Arguing between the peace party and the war party. A civil war within a civil war. The peace party wanted to map out next year's campaign to bring compromise, and the war party wanted to pursue it with the goal of total control. And now the Scots were getting involved, and adding a new layer of drama to the ordeal. They had never been on good terms with Cromwell, and of course we know that he had never liked them much either. It's not surprising then that they ended up on opposite sides of the argument. Spite came to full surface now though, as they began to accuse Cromwell as an incendiary, a person come just to stir up trouble on purpose, an enemy or secret agent. Cromwell stood strong in this field of battle just the same as any other. He was not to be moved. This had to end. There were real problems to be dealt with here, and the army was never going to get anything done this way. He pushed past all the raging din and made a proposal. He said the whole of the Roundhead army needed to be restructured. It needed to be separated from Parliament and become its own body. And to do this, all officers who were also members of Parliament must resign. A hush fell from the rafters like a heavy cloud and rested on the heads of the assembled men. The idea sounded sensible. If the army was separate, it wouldn't be plagued with party divisions. Parliament could vote on decisions instead of leaving them to bickering generals. Yes, maybe Cromwell was right. A bill was created, the Self-Denying Ordinance. According to this ordinance, all army officers that were members of Parliament must resign their positions, and new officers would be elected in their places. At first, several of the lords refused to sign the bill. They weren't particularly happy about this idea of self-denying. But the worst thing was that this bill would make it impossible to get their army positions back. The bill was modified to allow them to be re-elected, and after that they signed it. The bill now passed, a whole recreation of the Roundhead forces began. The New Modelled Army, it was called then. Today it bears the slightly shorter name of the New Model Army. Instead of working as small, locally based forces, as they had done before, all the Roundheads were now mashed into one big army. Now men from the east had to fight in the west, regardless if they wanted to or not. They couldn't choose to stay in their home area. They weren't part of the Eastern Association anymore. They were part of the New Modelled Army. They fought for Parliament, not their homeland. Regiments were restructured, the supply system was improved, and new spiritual training was implemented. 2 books were handed out to every soldier. The Soldier's Pocket Bible by Edmund Calamy, a Presbyterian preacher, and The Soldier's Catechism by Robert Ram, an Anglican priest. And I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of what Robert Ram looked like. Using a little creative license, though, I'd say he probably looked something like this. Just my opinion. Sir Thomas Fairfax, the hero of York, was chosen as first in command of this new army. And what of Cromwell? Didn't he resign like everyone else did when the Self-Denying Ordinance was passed? Well, not quite. It just so happened that the Committee of Both Kingdoms, which was the group of men in charge of overseeing the war efforts, realized that they just couldn't afford to lose him. His term of command was extended for 40 days. and then another 40 days. And so it went until at last he was given permanent command as Fairfax's right-hand man. Of course, he was quite satisfied with how this little plan had played out. Maybe they could actually start getting somewhere now.